the day you're in that product, like hour one, you can be in there prioritizing problems that you need to fix. And I think that's really valuable to show people. It's so much more fun, it's so much more valuable instead of saying, let's tell you about it, to say, let's show you.
We're excited to welcome Zakir Durumeric, co-founder of Censys, assistant professor of computer science at Stanford University, and one of MIT Technology Review's 35 innovators under 35. For over a decade, he's been advancing internet security research, earning a Sloan Research Fellowship, the Usenik's Security Test of Time Award, multiple IETF Applied Networking Research Prizes, and the Best Paper honors. Currently, Zakir splits his time between teaching and leading research at Stanford and helping organizations secure the internet through Censys. He's also the creator of fast internet scanning techniques that have transformed how researchers measure global online security. In this episode, we explore his path from groundbreaking academic research to entrepreneurship and his insights on the future of internet security. We're driving quite fast into this AI-driven world, and the pace that this technology is changing is profound. What does AI really mean?
Oh, that's an existential one.
Zakir, how do you stay true to your technical vision while navigating the pull of customer demands, investor input, and market noise?
This is a great question. It's not one where there's a simple answer. I think a lot of it is thinking about both sort of the how and the what. I think that you have to really understand very deeply what the customer problem is, what they are really trying to solve. That means talking to customers, potential customers, folks who understand where the market is going, and taking all of those inputs and then looking across all of them and thinking about them. But I think there's also not just the question of sort of what problem you're trying to solve, but how you're going to solve it. Sort of what is the DNA of the company, sort of what do you bring to the table. For us, we are fundamentally a cybersecurity company, but I think that we've always had this very sort of true commitment to the quality of the data we collect, the quality of the visibility. And for us, you have to think about both of those simultaneously. We can't think about only data and not customer problem. You can't think about only customer problem and not the quality of the data. Both have to be sort of things that we constantly think about. And we actually, even in the way we structure our sort of engineering teams, is there's a team that's constantly thinking about and benchmarking, how do we collect better data? How do we get closer to real time? How do we improve accuracy? And that team very much sort of operates under the auspices of that. If someone tells you the data is wrong, we've sort of failed. You don't want to ever hear from a customer that we missed something, or that we found something too slow, or something was a false positive. And we'll constantly benchmark and think about how we improve there. And on the other side, right, our product teams are constantly talking to the customer about the problems they're trying to solve and understanding those. And those two teams are in close communication with each other. What does the customer want to understand that they can't today? Where are they missing the visibility they need? Also, on the data side, what are attacks that we're seeing that might not yet be what customers are aware of? It's sort of what's right around the corner. But I think it's saying both of these are important in their own rights and figuring out how you balance and prioritize both of those. And so it's not an easy answer, but I think it's important to saying like both of these are fundamentally important to us, and that we believe our success is intertwined in getting both of those correct.
One of the things that you and I had discussed in our prep call was the different directions that perhaps you were pulled in, whether it was the feedback you were getting from customers, the investors, the market, and you found yourself going through this sort of circular motion to go back to the original thesis. Talk to me about that journey, because I can imagine it could be quite challenging to figure out, as you said, figuring out that customer problem and trying to stay true to what you're building. So talk to me about that journey.
Yeah, so we were founded out of the University of Michigan. We were actually originally a research project. We were going out and trying to understand how do we perform very large-scale scans of the entire internet. And we were originally really driven by academic questions. We wanted to understand, how are people patching? What were people missing? Why were certain sort of swaths of the internet not becoming more secure? And so we were very sort of technically driven originally as researchers. There are a lot of folks in industry who said this data is super interesting. Having this visibility helps in a whole bunch of different areas within the security ecosystem. You had red teamers using it, and pen testers using it, and sort of defensive VM teams using it, and threat hunting teams using it. And you even had folks outside of security using it. You had market analysts who were trying to understand things like what is a cloud adoption between Amazon and Google and Oracle and IBM look like, and how is that changing? In the beginning, we had really focused and said, let's try to go nail one use case really deeply. And that was sort of this question around shadow IT and internet-facing infrastructure, and really helping those defensive teams really understand and solve that perimeter problem. How do you actually correctly conduct attack surface management? We focus much of our product development on that one use case, really understanding that problem and how we solved it. But simultaneously, we kept a free product available to the whole community where anyone could come in and ask any question about any internet asset, about any host or certificate or website. And over time, that continued to grow, even though we hadn't necessarily invested a tremendous amount of R&D effort into it. And I think in part, the world changed to wanting more data in more places. I think that the world changed a bit in terms of where was this data important. But today we operate in this world where many facets of the security organization really, truly need this high quality, high fidelity internet visibility, whether it's someone trying to sort of reverse engineer a threat actor, or if it's someone trying to protect themselves, or someone trying to protect their or understand their third-party dependencies. And what we realized over time was, even though we had focused on just this one use case and gone really deep on this use case, there were many different use cases on top of this data. And in the beginning, every piece of advice we had received was one that effectively said, leave the data behind. The data is not what's important. Nailing your one use case is really what's important. You can't nail two. You're a small company. You can only nail one. There's limited value in the data itself. How many people want this large amount of internet data? So as we kept it on the back burner, we said, we think there's something here. We don't fully know what it is, but we think there's something there. What started to happen over time was that we started to see more and more connections between the types of questions people were asking in the attack surface management space and these other use cases. And what we realized was every time we built a feature sort of in one place, we inevitably wanted it in the other. Or someone was complaining about a data quality issue that they were seeing around as an academic researcher. Somehow that would later bubble into the attack surface management piece. And as time, I think, went on, what we realized is that every persona within the security organization has some slice of the internet they care about. Maybe it's what they're responsible for. Maybe it's what they're trying to acquire, and they're trying to understand that. Maybe it is their third parties. Maybe it's a whole sector, right? You have organizations like the EPA or CISA or NCSC in the UK who say, we really care about this whole swath of critical infrastructure. You have the threat teams at big CTI companies and the financial institutions trying to take apart some threat actor, and you realize we're using the same hints. We're connecting these pieces of infrastructure together using the same fields, using the same sorts of algorithms. It isn't just about the first party, it's about helping all of these folks with whatever slice of the internet that they need to really deeply understand. And so I think what ended up is we came back and we didn't necessarily go back to just saying, hey, we're going to be a data provider. But what we realized was that we needed to build a platform that allowed all of these different personas within the security organization to make sense of different parts of the internet. And then we could take this sort of shared foundation and use that to go deeper on the first party attack surface piece, to go deeper on the threat hunting piece, go deeper on critical infrastructure, go deeper on M&A and third party and all of these other pieces. But it was this realization that there's a lot shared between these, and a lot of this was a world where having that really high quality data and visibility and insight is what was really going to matter in the end for us.
It's interesting. So what you're saying is, if I go back to how I look at a startup figuring out what they're going to build, it seems like you had conviction in what you're going to build, but the market was somewhat dragging you in different directions. And when you've got different design partners in the early days, they might have different requests. Was that quite, in many ways, a challenge for you to sort of balance listening to the feedback you're getting and what you knew was the core product you were building?
Yeah, I think there's always a little bit of tension there. And I think this is something that exists in product generally. If you build what everyone asks you for directly, you'll end up with this kind of strange hodgepodge of different features that don't necessarily feel like it has a cohesive story. And a lot of times it means sort of looking beyond the very specifics of what's been asked and saying, like, what's the real problem you're really trying to solve? Or what is the pain point you really have? And if you ask enough people, if you start to push at this, you'll find this. But I think this is part of this area where product is a little bit more of an art than a science, is being able to push past this of what's actually being asked for in many cases, and sort of finding that kernel of what's really important and how that fits in and where that takes your story. And of course, there's a balancing act, right? There are some features that simply you have to build. I was on a call before this laughing about a Splunk integration. Like, no one's excited, right, about Splunk integration, but you have to have a Splunk integration because that's just sort of how the world works. And if your customer says, we need a ServiceNow integration in order to productionize you, you're going to build ServiceNow integration because they use ServiceNow, as do so many other people on the planet. But I think a lot of it is what comes down to like the sort of the core pieces, not the integrations, not the sort of the operationalization pieces, but the core security problem is sort of understanding that, not necessarily listening, but going past the listening and understanding what is the pain point, how do you more fundamentally solve that. And so I think it is particularly important in the beginning at a startup to figure this out, but it's also a problem that continues beyond startup sort of phase 2 to say, how do you have a product organization that's really understanding those pain points, bringing in their own domain experts, bringing in sort of these market pieces and saying, let's not just go where the market tells us to go. Let's really understand fundamentally what the problem is and how we can best solve it.
So, Zakir, take me back to the beginning, right? ZMAP. Tell me about what it is.
So ZMAP is a network scanner. So I think many folks have probably heard of Nmap, which has existed far longer than ZMAP has. ZMAP really wanted to take the idea of Nmap and say, how could we really efficiently do this for the entire internet? Not just one sort of organization or one swath or one IP ring, but everything that's out there on the internet. And the idea was, at the time for research, we wanted to understand sort of how to build a 10,000 foot view over everything. How do we understand, again, like the patching patterns of the internet by region or by country? How do we understand the certificate authorities that are trusted out there? And what we found is, having sort of built this based on our own needs to collect this data, we had also built a tool that was incredibly useful within industry as well. So it started academic, but then quickly transitioned to, and at this point, most of the contributions and usage of ZMAP and the other tool suite we originally created is by practitioners. It's by folks in industry who are trying to solve sort of real world problems. So we needed this own visibility for our research. Operators needed that sort of same level of visibility for their own work. But then after we built the tool, what we realized was that the tool would give you one point in time. If you knew what your question was ahead of time, you could go out and run a scan, you could get the results, you could analyze. But if you didn't know what your question was ahead of time, it was hard to really know how to use that tool to collect what you wanted. And if you wanted to go back in time, right, that simply wasn't a possibility when you had to go and run new scans. So the question became, how do we build an actual map of everything on the internet? How do we take these tools? How do we start to piece together a really cohesive view of everything that's out there, whether that be a host that's exposed, an Avanti, let's say, endpoint, or a VPN endpoint, or RDP, or something like that that might be targeted by a ransomware actor, or whether it was a piece of C2 infrastructure that an adversary had stood up. Let's start to build all of these pieces into the map so that people can much more easily ask questions about all of those pieces of the internet, rather than going off and manually running their own scans and trying to make sense of that data themselves.
If I was to ask you to sort of give me a use case, a typical use case, a typical customer and their use case of using it, what would that be?
One of them is, I would say, making sense of yourself and prioritizing the most important sort of internet-facing risks that you need to fix. So the number one attack vector for ransomware today is internet-facing assets. It is VPN endpoints, it is RDP endpoints, it is enterprise applications. That is sort of a lot of the targeted infrastructure from ransom. We've also seen sort of the attacks, the typhoon-based attacks that are going after critical infrastructure. A lot of cases, these are also going after internet-facing network infrastructure, Cisco routers, border devices, things like that. We are seeing attacks against utilities and other parts of critical infrastructure that are looking at internet-facing control systems and HMIs, or human-machine interfaces. And again, these are the pieces of your infrastructure as utility that might incidentally end up being exposed on the internet. A lot of our customers are using our data to prioritize what's most important to be fixed today. If you look at what you get out of a vulnerability scanner, you get a massive number of potential problems. If you look at what you get out of a sort of a CSPM or a cloud security solution, you see a massive number of problems. And the reality is the vast majority of those alerts will never be looked at or really processed. The question is, if a new vulnerability has come out that is being targeted by a ransomware actor, how are you going to respond in the first half hour? How do you simply ask the question, right? Do we have Avanti products in our company or for any of our suppliers? Where are they? How do we go and prioritize fixing them? A lot of it is asking questions like, what are all of the places someone could try to credential stuff on our perimeter? What are all the endpoints that don't have single sign-on that we know are going to be targeted? That's sort of the defensive piece. The other piece that we see a tremendous number of folks using it for is as part of incident response or by their threat hunting team. They see a log entry that looks really suspicious. Was this Netflix? Was this a command and control server? Was this something that you own? Can you triage and very quickly decide whether that's something you need to poke further into? If that bubbles up to the actual threat hunting team, who's either making sense of a more complex incident or doing more proactive threat hunting, it's a question of finding patterns or relationships between the internet assets. We found 2 of these. What are all of the other ones that look like these 2 things, because we want to block those as well? Or can we have this suspicious thing, can we tie that back to other infrastructure that we know belongs to a threat actor who is targeting us? So it's building those relationships. But it's really sort of making sense of some entity, whether it's yourself or a dependency or a threat actor or someone you're communicating with, and understanding who those are and then how you need to sort of action that, whether it be tasking the IT team to immediately go sort of get an asset off the internet, or whether it's updating firewall rules to say, let's block communication with that IP address that we know belongs to a threat actor.
You've got a deep technical background. As you said, this was originally a research project. As a company, to commercialize this and finding that balance between GTM and the technical piece, first of all, how did you connect the dots? And was it challenging?
Absolutely. I mean, I think every person who has been a founder will say it is challenging to figure this out. I think a lot of it that felt very natural for me is really the product piece. It's really understanding that problem and how you communicate that, how you understand what is the problem and how are you solving it, how do you communicate that to people. A lot of it is sort of shutting up and listening and talking to a lot of folks, but realizing really what's important is the problem and solving it, not necessarily building sort of technology for the sake of technology. And I think that's a little bit of a mental shift as you go in saying, I've built this amazing thing, doesn't everyone want it? And that's not really sort of the right question. The question is like, sort of given this visibility, like, can we solve a really meaningful problem that people are struggling with? That's really important. And if you're solving, and if you really truly understand that problem and you solve it, people will then want to sort of buy that product. And then you have to figure out how you're going to communicate what the problem is that you're solving and how you're solving it in a different way and why this problem is important. And I think one of the things that we like to do differently is that because we have this global visibility, we like to use our data to show people, not just tell people that this is a problem. We got pulled into the space because people said we want to go and solve these issues that we're having sort of with that level of visibility. And part of it is we've always gotten pulled forward by those folks who are sort of at the tip of the spear, have figured out how to use this data, have figured out how to do truly amazing things with it. For us, it's then showing sort of the rest of the world of these are where attacks are happening and this is what infrastructure looks like. One of the things I love about our product is when we go in for a conversation, we can simply just pull up someone's attack source and say, this is what it looks like. These are the problems that are there today. This is something that you can operationalize immediately. There is not a long thing where you need to go sort of get buy-in from everyone, where you need to go operationalize hardware or something. It's something that the day you're in that product, like hour one, You can be in there prioritizing problems that you need to fix. And I think that's really valuable to show people. It's so much more fun. It's so much more valuable instead of saying, let's tell you about it, to say, let's show you. Let's show you what's there. Let's see how this is playing out. And I think that for us is one difference, is letting people get in there and play and see and understand what's going on has been really successful.
Let's kind of take a helicopter view of where the company is today. How big is the company? How long has it been around? What current stage you're at?
So we're currently a Series C company, for folks who think about the world in that way. We've been around since about 2018. We have several hundred customers across the globe. A lot of our customer base is enterprise, commercially, finance, manufacturing. A lot of these folks who have larger internet-facing services, healthcare, a lot of tech companies. We also have a significant government business. We work quite a bit with governments who are trying to protect their own infrastructure of their country. They're trying to protect critical infrastructure. And we have folks that sort of spread the gamut from these defensive VM or attack surface management teams to SOC teams to threat hunting teams. So right now we have products that sort of span these multiple different use cases for folks, and we have quite a bit of business that's both sort of enterprise focused as well as government.
Going back to my original question, the PMF piece, right? So you've kind of gone through this whole journey of a research project and finding that alignment with GTM and listening to customers, that circular motion as you described it, to try to figure out what you're building, going back to that original thesis, and then to get to the point where you have all these customers around the world. When did you know you had product market fit?
Yeah, I mean, one thing is, I'm not sure if product market fit is like a 0 or 1 thing you have or you don't. I think it's something that you're constantly thinking about and iterating on. I think you see the success when you have repeatable sales, when you know and you can describe a problem and people sort of have this emotional connection. They say, yes, that is a problem we have. That is something that we have project for, or this is something we didn't have project for, but it's really important to us, or the results that you're showing to us are important and we want to buy it. It's a product market fit. Like, you can tell if you have it based on whether people are buying the product. Really, that's sort of the ultimate truth there. But I think it's not something that ever ends either. This is an ecosystem of security that's constantly changing. You're constantly thinking about how are attacks shifting. What new products are coming out? How are people even processing data, right? How is AI changing how people think about how they want to consume the insights and results out of your product? Some of the things that are the top priority to folks today, right? If you look at VPN endpoints, it's a very concrete example. This wasn't where folks were being breached 5 years ago, but today it's the number one initial access vector for companies. That changes sort of how people prioritize and thinking about these things. And so I think you're sort of looking for success, but it's also something where you should constantly be challenging yourself and thinking through, what are there other problems that people could be solving? What are the relationships we're seeing? How is the market changing? And it's not to say that I think you're ever there. It's something that you continually think about.
I mean, that's exactly the sort of answer I get from every founder and every investor I speak with on the show. Is it's never an end point to it. There's always a consistent evolution of it, especially now with the new evolution of AI. How do you rethink your product? You're a cybersecurity company, but ultimately you have to be an AI company as well, right? You have to start thinking about that.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that's actually a very exciting shift that's happening there. I think for a long time we've lived in this world of sort of these large black box behemoth security products. And I think there has been an increasing interest and sort of push for more sort of extensibility for companies to sort of have control over how these products are working, or to customize, or to think about this. We're seeing more and more of our customers who want to pull in data with other providers and piece it together to ask questions you couldn't ask of a single provider in isolation. I mean, for a long time, threat hunting teams have existed where they have 15 tabs open, and you sort of look at these different indicators and different tabs, and you hope you find a pattern, and then you bring it back and you see if it continues, and it's like, this is crazy. Like, I totally understand how we got here, but this is crazy. What's really exciting to see, I think, is how people are pulling data from these disparate sources together. People are starting to connect these MCP-based APIs to be able to sort of look across different pieces of the sort of security ecosystem, or different perspectives of what's going on, and to pull that insight out. Security as a whole is becoming more data driven. And it's becoming more analytic and sort of insight driven. And to someone who's come from that space, that's incredibly exciting to me. Because I think there's so much potential of what we're being able to achieve by saying, a lot of this is fundamentally visibility in data and sort of understanding problem within the security space. And I think oftentimes we like to pretend marketing wise that it's not. But so much of security really is having really good visibility and prioritization and context, and getting what I think many people would say would be the boring things right is really what's key to security. And saying we're going to figure out how we do that more cohesively, I think, is a really important shift that is starting to gain momentum.
Zakir, I just want to go back to a point you discussed earlier, right? So the VPN threat. It's one I've heard quite often recently in the market. So as far as the Censys is concerned, as a product to its customers and how it's protecting its customers, in relation to VPN as a threat, what sort of threats are associated with VPN, and how is, I guess, second part to that question is, how is Censys protecting against those threats?
So the reason I brought VPNs is because we see it as being the number one attack vector being used by ransomware groups to gain an initial foothold into companies. The other thing we're seeing is a lot of exploitation of other internet-facing applications or endpoints, but we see credential stuffing against VPNs and RDP. We also see exploitation of those endpoints, and if you talk to the incident response groups, you'll hear this sort of same story, that's where they're seeing attackers get this initial foothold. There used to be a time where we were really worried about drive-by downloads and like email attachments and things like this. And for the most part, a lot of those problems have been solved. And a huge shout out to EDR and some of these other vendors who have made improvements there. Also to Chrome and other really solid building blocks for that enterprise experience. Where we see the exploitation is what's internet facing. Where Censys fits into this picture is giving people the visibility into those devices. These are devices that, right, they're not going to have an agent on them. They're not going to have EDR on them. If you're lucky, maybe you're getting some decent logging out of them, but even that might be wishful in some cases. Really the question is, like, do you even know what's out there? Do you know it's exposed? Are you immediately responding when something comes up? Because adversaries are scanning so aggressively for these devices. So when you see an ODA come out, you immediately able to respond to that. Not wait for a vulnerability scanner module to come out, but just simply say, look, this just dropped. Do we have devices from this vendor? Where are they? Do our subsidiaries have devices from this vendor? Where are they? Having just that real-time visibility to respond, to be able to prioritize which of those are most important is where we fit into the picture. But then on the other side too, we're seeing attacks carried out from like compromised residential home routers from other sort of edge devices. And threat teams are also looking into visibility into those devices as well. So we see it from the other side too. Once those devices are compromised, how are those being used to mount other attacks? It's sort of both sides of that coin of understanding what is yours that you need to protect, also understanding what are the other devices out there and what that might tell you about an attack that's happening.
Next point I'd like to touch on, AI. Right, so we're driving quite fast into this AI-driven world, and the pace that this technology is changing is profound. What does AI really mean?
Oh, that's an existential one. I think there's a lot of hype around AI, without a doubt. I also think that there is tremendous potential, and we're seeing significant improvements in what AI is able to do. What I'm excited about for sort of AI is really how we help people with sort of these time-consuming tasks, or these tasks where you need to have domain knowledge that you learn over time. But how do you help a junior analyst sort of see connections they might not have seen otherwise, to sort of see relationships, to know how to respond? How do we get people the information about what they need to do to actually fix a problem? How do we get these agents to take care of these time-consuming, mundane tasks that simply have to happen to sort of move ourselves forward and get people to think about some of these higher level problems? I don't think AI is going to be sort of a magic bullet that is going to solve security problems. I think both on the adversary side and on the defensive side, AI is an accelerator. It helps people to automate and do things faster, to do things better, to customize it. And if you think about it from the adversary side, I don't think we're going to see like AI magically hacking into servers in ways that were totally unknown to us. I think what you're going to see in the beginning is really solid, customized phishing emails targeted to an individual or targeted to a company. We're going to see it being used to reverse engineer what's important to that organization to target. It's going to be taking these things that humans could do, but were painful or time consuming or required quite a bit of domain knowledge to do, and saying that that is going to get sort of democratized out on both the attacker side and on the defender side. So to me, what's really exciting is this question of how do we take the best-in-class visibility that Censys has in this understanding of what's out there and really arm security teams to go after and solve those problems, to understand what's most important, to very quickly remediate that, to help the IT teams get it right when they do remediate it. It's going to be a question of how do we sort of superpower all of the folks within the security organization with these tasks that today are really cumbersome and time-consuming.
Zakir, as a founder of a cybersecurity company, are you now thinking, I need to build AI to fight against the threats of AI? Or are you looking at it as more of, I need to, as you said, empower the technology that's already been built with AI? So is it more of looking at the technology, building it and empowering it with new AI, or really thinking about, we need to fight against this AI, so we need to build AI to fight against AI?
Yeah, I think right now it is sort of the former more than the latter. Now that could change as time has gone on, but I don't think we've seen AI fundamentally reshift the attack sort of landscape. We haven't seen that happen. Again, what we've seen, I think, is attackers figuring out how to put the least amount of effort into carrying out an attack. I think we see them getting faster. We see them getting sort of more sophisticated. We see them getting more targeted and tailored in what they are doing. But I don't think we're in a world where it is now the AI fighting the AI. I think it still is a lot of both sides figuring out how they bolster their operations using AI. I think as AI gets more sophisticated, some of this could change. I think we want to get more and more to the point where we can have auto remediation. We want more of this to be automated. For a long time, I think auto remediation has been a bit of a farce. It's simply too hard to understand today how to fix things in an operational environment without breaking things. And so we're very risk adverse. I mean, there's a lot of companies that talk about how they do auto remediation, but if you talk to the CISOs and the IT groups, I mean, most security organizations don't even have access to the assets that they're responsible for securing. It's something where they have to work with their IT counterparts to get things fixed. And so I think, to me, if we can start to figure out how we do that more safely, we can do that in a dependable way where we're actually willing to give agents access to fix problems. That's incredibly exciting. But we're going to have to get to the point where we're really trusting of that technology, of those agents to do that. I think on the path there is solving a lot of the problems that people are doing already. It's not going to be like a 0 to 1 thing where this just flips overnight. I think it's going to be a gradual. We're going to figure out how to automate all of these pieces along the way. And at some point, we're going to realize these agents have gotten good enough that we've automated a huge part of this whole problem. And we're at that point where we're ready to do that in a less gated fashion.
Zakir, do you trust it? Do you trust AI?
It's sort of like saying, do you trust Python? Right? Like, I don't, it's not like a sentient being, I think, to trust or to not trust. I think it is a tool that is imperfect today. I think it has a lot of potential. People are figuring out how to use it in incredibly valuable ways. But I think we also know that it is very, very error-prone. We still see lots of issues with hallucinations, with bad data coming out. I don't think it's at the point where we trust it wholesale, but that isn't to say that it also can't be incredibly valuable along the way to help people be more efficient. And I think that's that question is sort of how do we sort of harness what is there to sort of make people more efficient and productive along the way, while also improving AI itself. I think we'll also learn more as we try to actually use AI to solve specific problems. We're going to learn a lot more. A lot of what's coming out are these sort of general purpose models. I think what's really interesting for the security community is how can we take these and solve sort of interesting problems that we weren't trying to solve before. So do I trust it? Like, no. Do I think that changes anything in terms of it being an incredibly valuable tool for what we're doing across the security organization? No, I think it's an incredibly valuable tool. We have a lot of work to do to figure out how we make it more reliable in these environments.
I feel like with every evolution, whether it was the mobile age, the internet age, or the cloud, this new evolution has come with its own risks and its own benefits and rewards. I think, the risk of the internet and the mobile devices and all the things centered around having your your infrastructure in the cloud versus on-prem. These all came with benefits, pros and cons. What do you think are the biggest risks with AI today, and how is Censys preparing for that?
I mean, in a lot of ways, security lags IT, right? Sort of as technology innovates and changes, we realize that it becomes the next most interesting target for attackers, right? I mean, we've seen this. There's no reason that this would ever change. Right? After cloud came out, people started to move to cloud. There started to be interesting data in cloud. We realized there's a whole other sets of misconfigurations. Cloud became a big target. As we moved more applications to the web and had more internet-facing applications, those became a target. So absolutely, AI is going to be a huge target for attackers. It's going to be where there's a massive amount of data that attackers want, and also the ability to potentially sort of change behavior of what's actually happening in organizations. One of the big trends that's happening right now is people trying to figure out how do they expose data through MCP endpoints. Right, so how do we allow sort of agent-to-agent based communication? And as part of this, people are exposing endpoints, they're exposing data through these endpoints on the internet. And I think people are trying to set these up very quickly. A lot of these are, I think there's sort of a mad dash to figure out how you integrate your tools with what's happening in the AI ecosystem. One of the things we're tracking is how is more data being exposed through those MCP endpoints, where MCP endpoints showing up. And as you can imagine, we're starting to see these pop up in many different places as people are just starting to play with the technology. But a lot of cases, there's a lot of data available through these endpoints, and I think you see it somewhat similar to some of the exposure you saw around tools like Elasticsearch, where we saw a bunch of data breaches because people just didn't realize that these endpoints were out there, very happily serving anyone who found them all of the data about patients or about finances, about something else. We saw the same thing happen with S3 buckets. Now, these are dumber mechanisms, right, of course, but we saw a huge amount of data exposed through those new technologies. And that's one of the things we're looking at is how is data exposed, how are those endpoints exposed to really support what people are trying to do with AI.
Zakir, I want to take you to a completely different topic now, one that me and you hadn't actually discussed in the prep call, but I think is one that is quite interesting. You're a professor at Stanford, and you're also running a company, a founder of Censys. One of the common things that I'm seeing in the market today is one being the need for engineering talent with first principles, the fundamentals of computer science, and the other is there seems to be a less of a need for early entry level engineers. The L1, L2, L3 levels are slowly becoming less of a necessity in the market because of all the technology that's out there now, how AI is moving at such a fast pace. I think for you, I'd love to hear from you because you have a very interesting perspective. You're a professor, you're teaching engineering talent, you're out there talking to them, and also you're running a business, a cybersecurity company. I guess there's a two-part question. Where do your personal needs reside as a leader of a company, but also how are you balancing that, or I guess creating a bridge between what you know and the sort of advice you give new students?
It's funny. I think this problem has actually existed for a long time. There's always been this tension in computer science education between how much of this should be preparing people to be sort of coders or developers versus understanding the fundamentals of computer science. And I think you could have asked that question 10 years ago as well. And there's a lot of strong opinions on both sides of this. I think that there is tremendously more in computer science than simply how do you get your code to work and to compile. Same thing for ML and AI, right? It's not simply how do you go and just make the model do what you want it to do? How do you do prompt engineering? There's a lot to understand if you actually want to move the world forward, and like, how do these models actually work? Like, what are those fundamentals? And I think that's really key across all areas of computer science, is understanding what's going on and why. And that fundamental understanding and that fundamental curiosity is truly critical to computer science. It's how do you take these big questions and take them apart, and figure out how to architecture something that works. How do you figure out how you scale something? How do you build the right abstractions? Those problems are going to remain forever, and those aren't things that we see that AI is necessarily like solving, right? We don't see AI, I think, doing this really deep thinking about these types of things. I think where we see AI helping, right, is in the coding piece. How do we quickly build code that works, and do we ship it? How do you understand large code bases? And so I think that you could say, I guess we don't necessarily, I don't see it as like the all junior engineers sort of like fall out of the bottom and AI replaces them. I don't really agree with that premise. I think what you see is that a lot of what might have been sort of tedious work that was being done in the past, of how do you create this template, how do you get this data onto a page, those pieces are being automated. And I think really the question is, how are people at these different layers all going to take advantage of this? As a junior developer, you also have the ability now, right, to jump into a code base, right, you hadn't seen before, right, and be able to use AI to help you understand how to manipulate and work with that code base, how to find the right pieces, how to build tests, how to do these pieces. For the senior engineers, right, now some of the pieces that were junior engineers were doing before, maybe they're just doing now through AI. But the real question I would look at is not like, does this get rid of junior engineers, but the question of like, how do we get everyone to focus more of their time on the hard, meaty problems and less on the ones that are just sort of the tedious stuff you have to do? And everyone's done this as a developer. There's just stuff you have to do as a developer. And the reality is that stuff can take up a huge amount of time. To get this all piece to work, or to go look up some term you didn't know, or to figure out where in the code base something else broke, or this kind of stuff. I think the question is, how do people both at the junior level and the senior level sort of use AI to help with a bunch of that stuff and to focus on those hard, meaty, important questions? And I think those are the pieces that actually a lot of folks in the computer science education community have been saying for a long time are the really important things that we want our students to understand. Are those harder problems? How do you approach this? How do you take this apart? How do you make the system actually work? What's important? What's not? And so I think this is actually really exciting to see sort of how this can create opportunities for folks at every level of the engineering ladder.
So if I'm understanding this correctly, I guess what the way I understand it is the software engineer is going to change as far as like an L1 and L2, the skills that no longer are needed because of AI. Now these L1, L2 are uplifted by having to go deeper into into computer science. And does that, as a professor, does the syllabus change? Is there a different way of thinking about what you teach?
I don't think it necessarily changes fundamentally, because again, we've been trying to train folks to think about those big problems for a long time, to take things apart, to make sense of them. I think how people, though, write code will change. I think one of the questions we're trying to figure out is, how do you have people learn all of these pieces when the AI tools can sort of hide? It can be a crutch where people don't actually necessarily learn the fundamentals. And I think there's a question of, how do we teach when AI is being used, when you want people to use AI, but you want them to be using it responsibly. You want them to be using it in a way that they're still learning the fundamentals along the way. I think what you don't want is for people to be operating as such an abstraction that they no longer understand all the pieces below it or how they all fit together. And so I think the question is, I think what we want to teach is remains actually the same. The question is going to be like, can we teach this better? How do we teach this with AI? How do we teach this when students are using AI? How do we make sure that people are actually still really deeply thinking about some of these questions and problems when during school they might be able to offload some of those onto an AI and not actually really think about them? And I think those are a lot of the questions that we're thinking about.
As a founder and also as a professor, how would you define the sort of first principles thinking? How would you define it to our audience?
If you threw away like the programming language or the templating language or the libraries you're working with, what are those key pieces that are used across all of those environments, right? And no matter what language you're in, you think about how do you take a problem, how do you break it down into smaller pieces? How do you build abstractions where you're not duplicating code or repeating things? How do you think about what's going to be efficient for the machine to run? Do you understand why certain things are efficient or not based on how a computer operates? And so I would take those things where you say, this isn't necessarily tied to a specific programming language. This is tied to how we think about solving problems, understanding the problem, solving the problem. What are those pieces that are shared that are a little bit higher level approaches, abstractions? And I think people realize is that a lot of this stuff that you now take for granted and you don't think about every day because you've been developing for many years were things you really did have to learn. What is a good abstraction look like versus a bad one? You sort of see it and you know, but how do you get to that point where you're designing those correctly? What are the pieces that you really need to analyze and get the performance of really correctly? And what are the pieces where maybe you're cutting corners a little bit? What are the pieces that need really careful testing versus don't? How do you build sort of these boundaries between applications in a secure way? Every time, right, we see a lot of security issues emerge, interfaces or boundaries between systems where abstractions change. How are you going to build those in a safe way? How are you going to evolve code bases without breaking things in the past while also moving things forward, right? These are all of these pieces. A lot of it is like the how you think about and approach these problems. Why do you do things in certain ways based on how you understand how a CPU operates, how a GPU operates, how one of these large language models operates? But understanding those pieces and knowing how to build on top of that, I think, is what's going to be really important.
I obviously don't come from an engineering background. I come from a recruitment and investment background, right? But if I was to unpack what you've said there, and correct me if I'm wrong, the way I'm thinking about it is this necessity and need for first principles thinking is to, in many ways, be able to sort of review and defend against the technology that's being built, if most of it is being automated by AI, to make sure that AI isn't hallucinating, isn't making mistakes, and to be able to sort of put all those pieces together with the understanding of first principle thinking.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think it's not only defending, but it's also how do you build better systems on top too. I mean, there is definitely a defensive piece. I'm a security person. I will. You're preaching to the choir there, but part of it is also how do you build what comes next. Requires you understanding sort of the fundamentals of what's there. I think there's some development that's sort of just like building the same things. It's just work that has to be done, and then there's a question of like, how are you going to take us forward as a field and think about new ways of approaching these problems or building products. And I think those are the pieces that are the fun ones or the exciting ones. It's the reason why I think many of us went into computer science in the first place. And the question is going to be how do we keep pushing further on those, making sure that our students really understand those fundamentals.
The last thing I want to touch on is how AI is bringing different data sources together. It's one of the things we had discussed in our prep call. With the future of security, I guess, changing every day and every week with AI. And as you said, some of those changes is just how tools are interacting and AI is bringing these different data sources together. How do you think about that now, especially with the product that you're building at Censys?
I think one thing I want to call out is that most security organizations have dozens, if not potentially like hundreds of different tools that they are operating with on a regular basis. There are many, many different pieces of the security puzzle. And I think the way we've been operating for a long time is you have all of these tools and they all sort of dump data into like your SIM, into something like Splunk, and then we sort of weed through it and make sense of it. And sometimes we aggregate things together along the way. It sort of depends on the product, it depends on the use case. Sometimes that data gets aggregated together later on in Splunk or something like that. And these data can be all sorts of things. I mean, it can be like business importance, it can be organizational relationships, it can be different providers looking at census data alongside DNS data or next to like virus total data. I think what we're seeing is that folks don't want this just like unidirectional one-way push into a sink or into a SOAR or to a SIM or something like that. Folks want the ability to customize and manipulate how Censys works and how Censys operates with all of their tools. We, for example, do a lot of work of discovering what it is that you own on the internet. Our customers want to help define how we find things that they own. Not just processing the things that we found that they own, but how do they help tell us and customize and then change how we operate and then think about things? How do they use other data sources that they have access to help us find other things on the internet? So I think a lot of it is sort of moving those interactions earlier and having those be more interlinked, giving people more control, looking at Censys a little bit more like a data platform and not just sort of a data source. I think a lot of it is MCPs becoming one of these new interfaces for pulling these different pieces of data together and allowing that also to be a little bit more interactive and bi-directional than simply like, let's join these two tables together later on wherever they land. I think that piece is allowing more interaction. I think part of it too is that you see a lot of tools building the sort of same sort of dashboards and same tooling, and it's like every security product you has a dashboard that's like sort of the same but with slightly different colors and numbers, and like at some point you start to say like, we have really good data analysis tools out there. Like, why not just help people pull the data out that they need and ask the questions they want to of this data? Like, why are we reinventing Tableau inside of our product? And why is every security product reinventing Tableau inside a product? Like, that's not really what makes Censys Censys, right? What makes Censys Censys is having the absolute best data on earth and the best visibility and the best attribution, the best ownership, and making this real time with low false positives. It's driving the connections between threat actors and their infrastructure. Like, that's the core important part. Let's focus on being best on earth at those pieces and say, let's figure out how we integrate with your existing ecosystem of data tools. Let's get your data scientists having access to all of that data that will expose why we made the decisions that we made, the evidence we saw that sort of led us to that conclusion. Let's let you see that. Let's let you interact with that. That is a bit of a, I think, shift to say, look, like a lot of this is sort of data and insight focused, not just let's build the next dashboard and shiny pane of glass that we want folks from that team to use. If someone's doing an investigation, how do we let them pull data from all of these different places all in the same place and understand how it connects? So there's a lot of different pieces of it, but I think a lot of it to me is just how do we make all this a little bit more data driven, a little bit less big black box. How do we let people customize and control and affect what we do? How do we do that safely? These are fun questions to work on, to say like, you know your company, you know these pieces. How do we let you control how we collect data on the internet? You know about this threat actor. How do we build that into our own scanning engine so you can see the results and tie it back on your data? It's some of those questions.
Final question. First of all, thank you so much. This has been a super insightful podcast. I've really enjoyed doing this with you today. But the last question, I wish we had more time because I had some more follow-up questions regarding the last piece you mentioned. But one of the biggest things that I have found that has worked for me is education, constantly learning and developing, and a bit of a cliche, but being the dumbest person in the room and reading a lot. So one particular tradition we'd like to keep with this podcast is to always ask every single guest we have at the end is a book that they can recommend, one that has resonated with them, one that has had a even if it's not a profound impact, but enough impact that you took something away. What would that book be for you?
Yeah, this is a hard question. I always hate the question like, what's your favorite book? Because it's like, I feel like so much is taking all of these different books and thinking about them. Some of them challenge you and some of them you hate, but then stick with you forever. I can tell you one of the books I've read recently that has been on my mind is actually Malcolm Harris's Palo Alto book. And I know this is a divisive book and there's a lot of arguments. But one of the reasons I think it has been on mind was in part understand the relationship between Stanford and Silicon Valley, which is close to my heart as someone who has a foot in both of those areas. I think part of it too is I think there has been sort of a shift also in the security ecosystem between sort of West Coast and East Coast. These used to be, I think, sort of very different environments. And I sort of joke, but it's not actually a joke. Like I have two different like wardrobes. I have like two different lives for when I'm on like in DC. Or on the East Coast and when I'm on the West Coast. And these worlds are, I think, colliding more as we look at how the defense industrial base is adopting technologies. We're seeing, I think, changes in how cyber is deeply connected with geopolitical conflict now, as we see how AI and chips and hardware are a very geopolitically intertwined space. I think for a long time, the West Coast liked to think that it was completely disconnected. And that's really not the case. And I think that's becoming more and more apparent by the day. I didn't realize how much connection there had been between Silicon Valley and the U.S. government and other in decades past. It's been interesting to sort of learn and push me to understand more of the history around Silicon Valley, the history of how we got here. That has been interesting and I think increasingly relevant to what's happening in the cyberspace. Because, I think one of the things that's really interesting right now is a lot of these attacks are somehow connected to some piece of geopolitics. Whether this be as little as sort of just turning a blind eye to certain actors, to some of these attacks being really state actor driven. This is a geopolitical conflict that so many companies have found themselves dragged into, probably with not any interest of being part of that, but now being sort of pretty center of that stage. And I think that is shaping the industry quite a bit.
Yeah, no, I definitely see that. I think going back to the point you mentioned earlier on, it definitely is a shift when you're looking at and you've got an interesting perspective because you've obviously got the Stanford piece and also the Silicon Valley piece, but for sure, the West Coast and the East Coast, there is a bridge and a link between the two. My recruiters, when they call New York candidates, very different to when they're calling San Francisco candidates and when they make those calls. Okay, it was definitely a pleasure. Thank you so much for making the time to spend some time with me today on the podcast. I learned so much, and I feel like our listeners and our viewers are going to love this show. I'd love to have you back on. We'll do it in person. Thank you so much for making the time.
Absolutely. It was a lot of fun. Hope to be back.
Thank you, Zakir. This podcast was brought to you by Serrana Labs and powered by Harrison Clark. At Harrison Clark, we're at the heart of Silicon Valley's evolution and at the intersection of search and venture, funding the companies shaping the future and connecting them to the most elite cloud, data, and AI talent. To learn more, visit harrisonclark.com. If today's episode challenged your thinking, then share it with someone who's driving innovation. For even more insights on achieving product market fit, subscribe to our newsletter, the PMF Playbook, where we break down the journey from zero to product market fit. Visit thepmfplaybook.com. For more episodes, follow us on social media or visit insidethesiliconmind.com. Until next time, stay curious, stay consistent, and stay inside the Silicon Mind. See you soon.